Turning points in the home front, 1942. In this section, we will look at how the home front of the United States was specifically changed during the war years, and also the major turning points of the war, the three major turning points. The poster that you see there is a portion of Rosie the Riveter, We Can Do It, which inspired women to work in the defense industry. The Battle of the Atlantic, 1941 to 1943. The failure of the German air attacks to knock Britain out of the war led to the Battle of the Atlantic. Between 1939 and 1944, the purpose was to use U-boats to sink ships and starve out Britain. Sink the Bismarck. The German battleship Bismarck broke out of the Baltic Sea and with its 14-inch guns sunk the pride of the British Royal Navy, the HMS Hood, 15 miles away. Only 2 men survived. It also damaged the HMS Prince of Wales. On the 24th of May of 1941, the Bismarck was now the terror of the Atlantic, and orders were given to sink it at all costs. Swordfish, biplanes from the carrier HMS Ark Royal, were able to damage the rudder, in which the Bismarck was now going in circles. British battleships would then come in, and heavy cruisers would intercept and cripple the ship on the morning of May 27th. After less than 2 hours of battle, shells and torpedoes reduced Bismarck to a wreck. She capsized and sunk, with a loss of all but 110 of her crew, of some 2,300 men. Hitler's reaction to Bismarck's loss produced a very cautious approach to future German surface ships operating against Britain's vital Atlantic sea lanes. The Sea Wolves. At sea, convoys protected British ships from submarine attacks. German submarines dominated the Atlantic in 1942. German Admiral Donitz's plan was to create havoc with the U-boats called Sea Wolves since they attacked like a pack of wolves. The U-boat would sink a merchant ship in the convoy, and when the destroyers would break off from the escort and give chase, leaving the convoy defenseless, the rest of the U-boats would close in for the kill. A turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic came with the new sonar systems improving tracking of German U-boats, and the balance shifted when Allied ships attacked with depth charges. Operation Drumbeat. The entry of the United States in the war opened up the vast new hunting grounds for the German U-boat fleet. Operation Paukenschlag, drumbeat in English, would begin in January of 1942 and brings the U-boats their easiest pickings of the war. Over 300 Allied vessels were sunk during Operation Drumbeat along the U.S. coastline, ranging from New York Harbor to the Straits of Florida. According to Dr. Michael Gannon of the University of Florida, the systematic assault by German submarines on merchant tankers and freighters along the U.S. eastern seaboard in 1942 constituted a greater strategic setback for the Allied war effort than did the defeat at Pearl Harbor. The case for the claim is intriguing, includes a damaging assessment of the U.S. Naval Command, which ignored information that might have allowed to avert the disaster. The exploits of U-123 and 28-year-old Lieutenant Commander Reinhard Hartigan, who sank 19 ships on 2 American patrols and twice received Germany's highest decoration, the Knight's Cross. On a personal note, I was told a story from my 9th grade English teacher, Mrs. Mary Jane Floyd, who was present at a USO dance and witnessed the sinking of an American oil tanker off Jacksonville Beach. Dr. Gannon's research with Hartigan discovered that the same scene, U-123, had hit the tank with torpedoes and surfaced to finish her off. Hartigan was in rough seas and was afraid of overshooting and hitting a party that he saw on the beach. So he ordered the U-boat to submerge and then reappear between the beach and the tanker and finish it off. The home front, USA organizing the economy. The support for the war unified America across regional, national, and class divisions. The War Manpower Commission, Congress authorized the President to reorganize the government for war. The War Manpower Commission allocated workers among vital industries in the military. The War Productions Board invested funds in new factories and managed war supply and contracts under Sears and Roebuck's director David Nelson. Henry Stimson, a Republican was the new Secretary of War, convinced the president industry convert their consumer goods to defense production, applying mass production techniques to aircraft production. While most defense contracts went to establish industrial states, the South and West also benefited greatly. The arsenal of democracy. At first, the president wanted to have a number of regulations on industry with war contracts. He was convinced by David Nelson when he told the president, allow American industry to make a profit without all the constraints and watch what will happen. War production in the United States, existing factories were very effective in retooling for producing war materials. American industry produced a staggering 40% of all the war materials in the world, two-thirds for the Allied war effort, 297,000 aircraft, 193,000 pieces of artillery, 86,000 tanks, 2 million army trucks. The Great Depression was ended because of the upturn in the wartime economy. General Motors Corporation supplied 1/10 of all American war production. Willow Run. Henry Ford was given the contract for designing and building Willow Run, a factory with a 1-mile assembly line, which in the end would produce one B-24 Liberator bomber every 63 minutes. Ford would go on to produce more equipment for the Army than Italy would. In the Kaiser shipyards, they were able to reduce the number of man hours and the time it took to build a Liberty ship from 355 days to 8 days by using Henry Ford's assembly line technique. The Office of Price Management fought inflation by implementing price controls and rationing. Rationing was a fixed allotment of goods needed for the military. Households received ration books with coupons such as gasoline. Gas rationing was very hard in the western states. Items also included coffee, sugar, butter, meats, cheese, canned foods, shoes, and tires. Americans didn't mind the sacrifice. The black market did occur, buying at inflated prices. With frozen wages, prices, and rents, and with less to spend, government encouraged people to buy war bonds to control inflation. Propaganda. American propaganda during the war, the government was successful at soliciting participation in scrap drives. The Tokyo Kid that you see to the right was a racist display of characterizing Japanese with large glasses and rat-like features, buck-teeth fangs. Fictional radio character Hop Harrigan fought the Axis powers in their shows. The federal government tried to maintain war support through drives and campaigns and managing the war news. Censorship was uneven. The Office of War Information enlisted Hollywood to produce films supporting the war. The most successful war movies dramatized the courage of the Allies, like Casablanca, The Great Dictator, A Yank in the RAF, The Flying Tigers, and Guadalcanal Diary. Ethnic minorities in the war effort. Mexican Americans. In order to meet the wartime demands for their crops, Southern farmers began to recruit Hispanic workers from Mexico at harvest time. This was known as the Braceros program. The growth of the Mexican Americans in Los Angeles and increased racial tensions in the city prompted a week-long riot known as the Zoot Suit Riot, after the popular suits of the time. Native Americans were a key labor force for military supply depots, and many stayed in cities when the war had ended. African Americans. The Double V campaign was an attempt by civil rights leaders to promote democracy at home as well as abroad. In it, African Americans tried to demonstrate the irony of Americans fighting against racial bigotry in Nazi Germany and the other Axis countries while upholding racism and discrimination inside the United States. A. Philip Randolph and his Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters negotiated with FDR an executive order ending racial discrimination in the defense industry, hiring in exchange for cancellation of their march on Washington, D.C. in 1941. The Fair Employment Practice Committee, the federal agency established in 1941 to curb racial discrimination in war production, jobs, and government employment. FDR's issuance of the Executive Order 8802 banned racial discrimination in employment for defense industries. The migration caused by the war crossed traditional, regional, and racial boundaries. African American migration out of the South accelerated as migrants went to the northern and western cities, hoping to find better economic opportunity and less racism. Economic opportunity was available, but racism still existed. Racial tensions erupted in violence in 50 cities in 1943 alone. Women during the war. Employment of women increased enormously during the war years. With millions of men enlisting in the military, over 8 million women found themselves open to opportunities that previously had been closed. Women became tool makers, lumberjacks, blacksmiths, and so on as valuable members of the civilian workforce that helped produce the goods needed to fight the war. Of 6 million women employed, 75% were married and over the age of 35 with children. Women were encouraged to work by poster images of strong, handsome women. The U.S. government developed the image of Rosie the Riveter to encourage women to take over production jobs. The 1942 poster shows a woman worker with a polka dot bandana associated with Rosie, and it equates the bandana with the hats worn by Wax, Waves, and other women in the armed services. Women played vital roles in the shipyards and the aircraft industry. Many men and women married as economic times improved, and the war intensified romances. Married women often followed their husbands to various military posts. Latchkey children of working mothers were left to fend for themselves. Children also participated in various war drives and campaigns. Men and women in the military. In 1939, the U.S. military had 334,000 soldiers, sailors, and Marines, the 18th largest military in the world. In 1945, the number had reached 11 million in the Army and Army Air Forces and 3.4 million in the Navy and Marines. By 1945, 5 million volunteered for active duty. The selected service system would help meet the U.S. manpower needs, providing 10 million more. Called GIs because everything was government issue, so they started calling themselves government issue or GIs. Army Chief of Staff General George C. Marshall pushed for a Women's Auxiliary Corps, known as WACS, and around 350,000 women enlisted in the armed forces. In the WACS, and the women also accepted for volunteer emergency services, the WAVES, the Navy component, and equivalent groups for women in the Marine Corps. Coast Guard and Air Force women served as nurses and members of the WACS, WAVES, SPARS, and the Marine Corps Women's Reserve. The civilian auxiliary of the Air Force used women pilots to ferry aircraft across the nation, known as WASPs. African Americans serving in the military. About 1 million African Americans served in the military in segregated units. They often encountered discrimination on and off the military bases since they were located in the South. General Benjamin Davis Jr., the man you see to the right, was only the fourth African American to graduate from West Point. During the war, the airmen commanded by Davis compiled an outstanding record in combat against the Luftwaffe. They flew more than 15,000 sorties, shot down 112 enemy planes, and destroyed or damaged 273 on the ground at a cost of 66 of their own planes, and losing only about 25 bombers, and won more than 850 medals. Some military leaders, including Eisenhower, suggested changes to the U.S. military policies regarding racial discrimination, partly in response to the need more combat troops. Many African American servicemen distinguished themselves during the war. Fifth Army held the beachhead against the Nazis. General Patton said of the African American tankers that were sent to him, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers ever to fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army. I don't care what color you are, so as long as you go up there and kill those Kraut sons of a bitches." Native Americans. 25,000 Native Americans served in the armed forces, including the famous Navajo code talkers. Because Navajo is a complex grammar, it is not mutually intelligible. At the time, it was still an unwritten language. Its complex syntax and phonology, not to mention its numerous dialects, made it unintelligible to anyone without extensive exposure and training. One estimated indicated that at the outbreak of World War II, fewer than 30 non-Navajo could understand the language. Joe Medicine Crow, the man you see pictured to the right, completed all 4 tasks required to become a warrior chief: touching an enemy without killing him, taking an enemy's weapon, leading a successful war party, and stealing an enemy's horse. He touched a living enemy soldier, a German, and disarmed him, after turning a corner and finding himself face to face with the young German soldier. The collision knocked the German's weapon to the ground. Crow then lowered his own weapon, and the two fought hand to hand. In the end, Crow got the best of the German, grabbing him by the neck and choking him. He was going to kill the German soldier, he said on the spot, when the man screamed out, "Mama!" Crow then let him go. He also led a successful war party and stole 50 horses owned by the Nazi SS from a German camp, singing a traditional Crow honor song as he rode off. Medicine Crow is the last member of the Crow tribe to become a war chief. Internment of Japanese Americans. Executive Order 9066 on February 29, 1942 was issued. To counter fears of a Japanese invasion, FDR authorized EO 9066, removing Japanese Americans from the Pacific Coast states. On March 18th, the War Relocation Authority was created for the purpose of interning all West Coast Japanese Americans, 112,000 that were born in Japan, and 100,000 Nisi. Nisi were Japanese Americans that were a second generation, born in the United States. Therefore, they were U.S. citizens. The state of Hawaii was treated very leniently and yet had the majority of percentage of Japanese Americans living there. In Supreme Court cases, Hirabashi versus the United States on June 21, 1943, the Supreme Court unanimously upheld ethnic internment by not considering the issue of Japanese exclusion from the West Coast, citing the authority to wage war successfully. In Korematsu versus the United States on 18 December 1944, the Supreme Court voted 6-3 to uphold the exclusion of Japanese from the West Coast, a military decision because the U.S. was at war with Japan. It should also be noted that approximately 11,000 German Americans and German nationals and fewer than 2,000 Italian Americans and Italian nationals were also in internment camps. April 1942, air attack on Japan, launched from the carrier Hornet and led by Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, was the most daring operation yet undertaken by the United States in the young Pacific War. Though convinced as a diversion that would also boost American and Allied morale, the raid generated strategic benefits that far outweighed its limited goals. The B-25B Mitchell medium bomber was selected as the delivery vehicle, and tests showed that it could fly off the carrier with a useful bomb load, enough fuel to hit Japan and continue on to the airfields in China. Most of the 16 B-25s, each with a 5-man crew, attacked the Tokyo area. Damage to the intended military targets was modest, and none of the planes reached the Chinese airfields, though all but few of their crew survived. However, the Japanese high command was deeply embarrassed. 3 of the 8 American airmen that were captured were executed. The Philippine Islands, December 7, 1941 through May 10, 1942. Thailand surrendered, followed by Guam, Wake Island on December 23rd, the Gilbert Islands, Hong Kong on December 26th, British Malaya and its capital in Singapore from February 21st through March 1st, 1942. Allies were defeated in the Dutch East Indies, including the island of Java. On March 11th, General Douglas MacArthur secretly left the Philippines for Australia after establishing headquarters on the Bataan Peninsula at the fortress of Corregidor in Manila Bay. On May 7th, U.S. forces surrendered Corregidor, while 75,000 Filipino and U.S. troops surrendered on the Bataan Peninsula. MacArthur was named Supreme Allied Commander in the Pacific, and in Australia vowed that I shall return. He was awarded the Medal of Honor for escaping from the Philippines. The Bataan Death March. During the battle for the Philippines on April 3, 1942, after 3 months of siege, the Japanese 14th Army, led by General Mashima Homma, defeated U.S. Filipino forces, leading to the surrender by U.S. Major General Edward P. King. The Japanese planned the march in order to move 78,000 prisoners from the southern Bataan Peninsula, removing them from the theater of operations in preparation for the siege of Corregidor. The Japanese failed to supply the prisoners with food or water until they reached Bologna. Many of the prisoners died along the way of heat or exhaustion. Prisoners were given no food for the first 3 days and were only allowed to drink water from filthy water buffalo wallows on the side of the road. They were starved and mistreated, often kicked or beaten along the way, and many of them fell or were bayoneted. Only 54,000 reached the camp. 7 to 10,000 died along the way, and the rest escaped into the jungle. One of the survivors was Mats Tonelli. Tonelli was coached by Elmer Layden, one of the famous four horsemen at the University of Notre Dame. He was a star there, scoring the game-winning touchdowns against Southern California, the college where he originally wanted to go, and helped to lead the Fighting Irish to a national ranking. The Chicago Cardinals would sign him from the NFL, and he made between $3,000 and $7,000 a year. And then he signed a 3-year contract in 1941, with the war just around the corner. He signed up for the Army because he knew he'd be drafted sooner or later and wanted to get his 1-year requirement out of the way. Tonelli was then stationed at Clark Airfield in the Philippines, the biggest air base in the Pacific. When Pearl Harbor was bombed, and the Japanese bombed Clark Field, his world would change forever. According to Tonelli, on the first day of the march, a Japanese guard demanded Mott's Notre Dame class ring. Later, a Japanese army officer took the ring from the guard and recognized the name inscribed on it. When Tonelli asked, "How do you know who I am?" the Japanese officer replied, "I was a student at USC and watched you score the winning touchdown. You need to hide this ring where no one will find it." He then survived a 60-mile march in the hands of his captors while many around him died. He would say, quote, "For 7 days we didn't have any water. If you went to the stream to drink, they would shoot you. Bodies were all over the place. If you didn't go on, you'd be shot or bayoneted." End quote. He also remembers marching towards a human head on the pole with bugs and flies all over it. He remembers heads cut off by Japanese aggressors. He remembers people fighting to keep up with the pace so they would not be killed. He would say, "In the first camp, we were burying 20 to 30 guys a day. You could smell the dysentery everywhere. I can still smell it today." He also remembers having to do push-ups over the tree until he fell in. He remembers being fed 1 ball of rice 3 times a day for each meal. And he remembers starvation, exhaustion, and disease. He was about to give up when he was given his prison ID number, which was the same number he wore at the University of Notre Dame. When Tonelli entered the Second World War, he weighed 210 pounds. When he left and was liberated from Allied forces from a Japanese prisoner of war camp, he weighed 80 pounds and was sick with disease. The Battle of Coral Sea. The Japanese planned to take Australia and strike at Japan again. From May 4th to 8th, the Battle of Coral Sea was the first naval engagement in world history where no surface vessels met in combat. No ships, fighting ships, and all combat was done by carrier-based airplanes. Japan's southward advance towards Australia was halted and turned back from Port Moresby, New Guinea. The U.S. lost the carrier the USS Lexington, you see pictured there, and the USS Yorktown was severely damaged. The nearest repair facility was at Pearl Harbor, almost 5,000 miles away. Japan only lost 1 light carrier and suffered damage. But this was the first check on Japanese aggression. They came at the Battle of Coral Sea. Turning points of war. There'll be three major turning points in the war that would change the course of war in favor of the Allies. The first is the Battle of Midway, June 4th through 6th, 1942. Yamamoto, intended to surprise, was thwarted by the superior American communications intelligence, which deduced his scheme well before the battle was joined. This allowed Admiral Chester Nimitz, the U.S. fleet commander, to establish an ambush by having his carriers ready and waiting for the Japanese. June 4th, 1942. In the second of the Pacific War's great carrier battles, the trap was sprung. The perseverance, sacrifice, and skill of U.S. Navy aviators, plus a great deal of luck on the American side. The Japanese first struck Midway Islands and had no knowledge where the U.S. Pacific Fleet was located. VB-6 and VS-6 Dauntless bombers from the Enterprise bombed and fatally damaged carriers Kaga and Akagi, while VB-3 Dauntless from Yorktown, which arrived from Coral Sea and was quickly repaired, bombed and wrecked the carrier Soryu, while the Japanese planes were changing the bombs on the deck. At 11 o'clock, one Japanese carrier that escaped destruction that morning, Hiroshima, launched Val dive bombers that temporarily disabled Yorktown around noon. 3.5 hours later, Hiroshima's Kate torpedo planes struck a second blow, forcing Yorktown's abandonment. In return, Dauntless from Enterprise mortally damaged Hiroshima in a strike around 1700 that afternoon. The destruction of the carrier strike force compelled Admiral Yamamoto to abandon his Midway invasion plans, and the Japanese fleet began to retire westward. The base at Midway, though damaged by the Japanese air attack, remained operational and later became a vital component in the American Trans-Pacific offensive. The U.S. only lost 2 ships, including the carrier Yorktown, and 300 men, while Japan lost 4 carriers, 275 planes, and most of their experienced pilots, and 4,800 men, and its naval superiority after the Pearl Harbor was the damage. This was the turning point of the war in the Pacific. The Battle of El Alamein. The Desert Fox, General Erwin Rommel, the man you see pictured in the upper right, was sent with his Africa Corps to reinforce the Italians who were losing to the British. Rommel would push the British to the border of Egypt, and Rommel's craftiness earned him the nickname Desert Fox. The war in the desert in North Africa was pivotal. If the Africa Corps got to the Suez Canal, the availability of the Allies to supply themselves would be severely dented. The psychology blow of losing the Suez and losing in North Africa would have been incalculable, especially as this would have given Germany near enough free access to all the oil in the Mid-East which they needed. Rommel's army had driven to El Alamein, where General Bernard Montgomery, Monty, took command of the British Eighth Army. The Battle of El Alamein is usually divided into 5 phases, consisting of breaking in October 23rd to the 24th, the crumbling of 24th to 25th of October, the counter of 26th to 28th October, and Operation Surcharge 1st to the 2nd November, and the final breakout of 3rd and 7th November. On 8th of November, Erwin Rommel learned of an Allied invasion of Morocco and Algeria that was under the command of General Dwight David Eisenhower. His depleted army now faced a war on 2 fronts, and so he retreated. Winston Churchill was convinced that the Battle of El Alamein marked the turning point in the war and ordered the ringing of church bells all over Britain. As he would later say, before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat. As mentioned earlier, Operation Torch, November 8, 1942, was the first Allied amphibious operation with General Dwight Eisenhower, who landed at Oran Casablanca in Algiers, North Africa. Operation Torch signaled U.S. entry into the European ground war. British-American troops first fought Vichy French forces, who offered little resistance. At the Battle of Kasserine Pass in February 1943, was the first major engagement between the United States and Axis forces in Africa. Inexperienced and poorly trained led American troops suffered many casualties and were quickly pushed back over 50 miles. Major General George S. Patton Jr. would replace Major General Lloyd Fredendall and was relieved by Eisenhower and sent home. Patton quickly would discipline the Army after capturing Pass and would be given a nickname by his troops, Old Blood and Guts. Our blood, his guts. The third and final turning point was the Battle of Stalingrad. Stalingrad was a major industrial city on the banks of the Volga River, a vital transport route between the Caspian Sea and northern Russia. The region in the Caucasus, with its large oil fields, which were needed for the German army. Capturing the city would be a major ideological and propaganda coup. The city was named after Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union. The battle began on August 23, 1942, and by September of 1942, the German commander of the Sixth Army, General Paulus, assisted by the Fourth Panzer Army, advanced in the city of Stalingrad. Stalin's order was not a step backwards. The Luftwaffe would leave the city in rubble, as you could see to the left. And by November, the German army had captured 9/10 of the city. The last part of the city was on the other side of the Volga River. But snipers were very effective, such as Vasily Zaitsev that you see in the middle. In but 10 days' time, he nearly killed 40 Germans, and SS Colonel Heinz Thorwald was dispatched to Stalingrad for the sole purpose to kill him. Thorwald was in charge of the sniper school for the SS. However, Zaitsev would kill Heinz. In Operation Uranus, on November 8, 19, the Russians were in a position whereby they could launch a counteroffensive, and the Red Army launched it, a two-pronged attack targeting the weak Romanian and Hungarian troops, which were protecting the Sixth Army's flank. Marshal Zhukov's Sixth Armies of 1 million men surrounded the city. The bulk of Sixth Army, some 250,000 and 300,000 men, was in the city, and Zhukov, having used his resources to go around the city north and south, had trapped the Germans at Stalingrad. By January 30th, 1943, Hitler promoted Paulus to General Field Marshal, since no German field marshal had ever been taken prisoner. Hitler assumed that Paulus would fight on or take his own life. However, when the Soviet forces closed on his headquarters at the ruined Gum department store, the next day Paulus would surrender. Only 91,000 Germans were left of the 330,000. Of those 91,000, less than 10,000 would survive the prisoner of war camps in the Soviet Union. The Soviets lost 1.2 million soldiers and civilians dead, but it was the turning point of the war in Europe. Part 4 begins with the Allies on the march. The war conferences. The question was when a second front would be opened against Germany. The Soviets were being hammered by the Germans. At the Casablanca conference, FDR and Churchill would meet and decided that Hitler was the number one enemy. Stalin's Soviet Union needed desperate help, and after the defeat of Germany, the U.S. would look to the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union to help defeat Japan. It was decided at the Casablanca conference that the Allies would only accept unconditional surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan, which is still debated by historians today. At the Turin conference, Stalin met with the British and the American leaders who promised to invade France within 6 months. It was the first time that all three met. Meetings of the Allied leaders at Casablanca and Turin revealed that the Allies possessed differing views of the world after the war. Stalin wanted more territory. FDR believed Britain should free its colonies. The Pacific, the battle for Guadalcanal. Having halted Japan's advance at Midway, Allies on the offensive drove the Japanese back to their own islands. On October 25th to 26, 1942, the Battle of Savo Island, north of Guadalcanal, was a major Japanese offensive, temporarily deprived Allies on Guadalcanal of air and naval support. John Basilone, on October 24, 1942, the man you see in picture in the right-hand corner, Japanese forces began a frontal attack using machine guns, grenades, and heavy mortars against the American heavy machine guns. Basilone commanded two sections of machine guns that fought for the next 2 days until only Basilone and two other Marines continued fighting. Basilone moved an extra gun into position and maintained continuing fire against the incoming Japanese forces. He then repaired and manned another machine gun, holding the defensive line until replacements arrived. As battles raged, ammunition became critically low, and with supply lines cut off, Basilone fought through hostile ground to resupply his gunners, which urgently needed ammunition. Toward the dawn of the battle, Basilone fought Japanese soldiers using only a 45 caliber pistol and a machete. By the end of the engagement, the Japanese regiment was virtually annihilated. For his actions during the battle, he received the United States' highest award for bravery, the Medal of Honor. The Sullivan brothers, pictured below, were five siblings who were killed in action shortly after the sinking of their light cruiser, the USS Jenna, the vessel on which they had all served. On November 13, 1942, Joseph, Francis, Albert, Madison, and George Sullivan. Their sacrifice would lead to the War Department adopting a policy of siblings not serving on the same vessel or on the same unit in the ground or in the air. It is their sacrifice that would inspire Spielberg to do his movie Saving Private Ryan. On November 12th through the 15th, Admiral Halsey destroyed Japan's fleet of 28 ships and transports, and the Battle of Cape Esperance prevented Japan from keeping the Solomons. The naval battle of Guadalcanal kept Japan from reinforcing the island, and they lost it. By February 9th, 1943, the final Japanese forces were withdrawn from the island, bringing the first land victory by U.S. Marines at Guadalcanal. Island hopping. Unlike the European theater war, racial hatred in the Pacific was intense on both sides. Japanese would not respect the rights of prisoners, and Americans rarely captured Japanese. If they did, they would simply display no quarter due to the brutal treatment towards their own soldiers and Marines. Targeting islands, U.S. forces planned to recapture the Central Islands, the Gilberts, the Marshalls, and the Carolines, the Marianas, and the Bosnians, in order to prevent the Japanese from using these islands as bases for strikes against MacArthur and Nimitz. Once rid of Japanese troops, and Allied forces would then push into the Philippines and to the coast of China and eventually hit the Japanese mainland. Island hopping. MacArthur and Nimitz devised a plan in defeating the Japanese in the Pacific. The American forces will bypass Japanese strongholds in the Pacific and hop to the next island. The island hopping campaign began in late 1943 and involved American invasion of strategic Japanese-held islands such as Tarawa and Saipan. Back to Europe and the Mediterranean. North Africa. The British Army captured Tobruk on November 12, 1942. During the El Alamein campaign, of Rommel's 100,000-man army was killed, wounded, or taken prisoner. He also lost over 450 tanks and 1,000 guns. The British and Commonwealth forces suffered 13,500 casualties, and 500 of their tanks were damaged. However, of these, 350 were repaired, were able to take part in future battles. In Tunisia, the Tunisian campaign finally ended on May 10, 1943. Over 250,000 German and Italian troops were taken prisoners of war, including most of the Afrika Korps. The North Africa theater casualties, U.S. casualties totaled about 18,500, while Axis casualties over a 2-year fighting period totaled nearly 500,000, including Canadian French forces of 2,500 ships. The next target was Sicily. Patton's plan called for the landing in Palermo, north of the island, and heading east to Messina, while Montgomery's 8th Army would strike in the southeastern portion of Sicily and work north to Messina, creating the same pincer movement as in Tunisia. Montgomery's plan called for Patton to protect Monty's left flank and both head to Messina. Eisenhower endorsed Monty's plan. During the invasion, Patton would eventually break off and race to Palermo, while Montgomery pushed towards Messina. Palermo would fall, and then Patton would use a series of amphibious landings to take Messina, and Patton would arrive in Messina first. On August 17th, Sicily fell to the Allies with U.S. casualties at 7,400, Allied losses at 25,000 total. German and Italian losses at 167,000. However, it should be noted, if Eisenhower had endorsed Patton's plan, they would have captured the entire lot before they could escape to Italy. Italy. On July 25th, Mussolini abdicated to King Victor Emmanuel, and Prime Minister Bahaggio sought to end the war. After the fall of Mussolini, bitter fighting for the control of Italy took place between the Allies and Germany. Hitler was determined not to give it up. The Allied invasion of Italy was the Allied landing on the mainland on September 3, 1943, by General Harold Alexander's 15th Army Corps, comprising Lieutenant General Mark Clark's U.S. 5th Army and General Bernard Montgomery's British 8th Army. Patton, unfortunately, was in Eisenhower's doghouse, as he was guilty of slapping 2 soldiers with PTSDs in Sicily. It was soon discovered that afterward that the German High Command was very interested where Patton was stationed and would not believe the U.S. would fire and send home their best field general. The operation followed the successful invasion of Sicily during the Italian campaign, and the main invasion force landed around Salerno on the western part in Operation Avalanche, while 2 supporting operations took place at Calabria, Operation Baytown, and Taranto, Operation Slapstick, on September 8th. Italy was led by the new prime minister and accepted an unconditional surrender on October 13th. After Mussolini escaped to northern Italy, Italy declared war on Germany. Invasion on all fronts, 1944. To keep the Allies from landing in the northern part of Europe, Hitler authorized the creating of the Atlantic Wall of Fortress Europe. And as we see in this sideway cutaway, we'll see the problem that the Allies would have to face in landing in Europe. They would have to go to low tide, because if at high tide, their craft would be hit by belching tanks, teller mines, ramps, and hedgehogs. So they had to come at low tide, and then had to work their way up the beaches, where then they would encounter barbed wire and minefields, also under constant fire from concrete enforced pillboxes and concrete bunkers with heavy guns. The invasion of Europe. General Eisenhower was made Supreme Commander of Allied Forces at the insistence of Churchill. Operation Overlord was the code name for the invasion of France, also known as D-Day. On January 16, 1944, after Ike assumed his post as European Allied Supreme Commander, a third major offensive was planned into France across the English Channel, the coast of Normandy. Operation Fortitude was a code name for the military deception employed by the Allied nations as part of the overall deception strategy during the build-up to the 1944 Normandy invasion. Fortitude's aim of misleading the German High Command as the location of the imminent invasion. A fictional army was built around General Patton, who the Germans were convinced would lead the invasion at Pas-de-Calais. A great number of fake tanks, artillery trucks, and planes were placed in the southeastern portion of England. The operation was intended to divert Axis attention away from Normandy when the invasion would occur on June 6, 1944, and delay reinforcement by convincing the Germans that the landings was purely a diversionary attack. The operation was one of the most successful military deceptions employed during the war, and arguably the most important. A crossword puzzle was discovered 5 weeks prior to the invasion, and words that appeared in the crossword puzzle were code words that appeared in the London Telegraph: Mulberry, Neptune, Omaha, Utah, and Overland. But it was found out that the crossword was created by a high school physics teacher, and it ended up being just a mere coincidence. D-Day, the 6th of June, 1944. The invasion begins with an airborne assault of the United States 82nd and 101st Airborne Divisions and the British 6th Airborne Divisions, which was parachutes and gliders. Their mission was to take the coastal cities for link up with a seaborne invasion. However, they were scattered all over the drop zones and didn't make it, and were sometimes mixed in with the various different units. This invasion was the largest amphibious operation in world history, involving 4,000 ships, 600 warships, 10,000 airplanes, and 176,000 troops. The Americans would land on Utah, where Rangers first had to scale a cliff to knock out the heavy guns. They accomplished their mission and discovered the guns were never put into place. Omaha would be the bloodiest fight of the entire invasion of all beachheads, where the U.S. lost over 2,000 killed on the first day. The British encountered lighter resistance on Gold and Juno beaches, and the Canadians landed on Sword Beach. But Hitler believed Normandy was a diversion and refused to send his elite SS Panzer tank divisions to attack for 2 weeks. Breakout Operation Cobra. Fierce fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy made it very difficult. American General Omar Bradley came up with a plan for the American 8th Army Air Corps to blast the hedgerows and send in the armored divisions. The Allies broke through the German lines and raced across France. By July 2nd, some 1 million Allied troops had landed, 566,000 tons of supplies, and 171,000 vehicles. In Germany, Operation Valkyrie was a planned coup d'etat led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg to assassinate Hitler. He survived the bomb blast, unfortunately, in an attempt on his life on July 20th. Von Stauffenberg and some generals were executed. Rommel was also implicated in the plot, but was allowed to take his own life. Paris was liberated by the Allies on August 25th. Southern France was liberated by the advancing Allies by August 28th. Germany was now in full retreat to their borders. Luxembourg was liberated from the Nazis on September 11th. Collaborators and women who slept with the German soldiers, as you see on the bottom right, would have their hair shaved and swastikas put on the foreheads. Male collaborators were just shot. Operation Market Garden was the largest airborne operation. Montgomery had a plan to end the war by Christmas. Elements of 3 airborne divisions, over 1,500 planes, and 500 gliders would drop elements of these divisions into Holland in an attempt to capture the corridor leading from Eindhoven to Arnhem that crosses the 5 water bodies, including 2 major river bridges on the Rhine River. The initial landings were a great success. 2 of the bridges were captured intact. The bridge at Somme was destroyed before it was secured. The major river bridges over the Wall at Nijmegen and the Rhine at Arnhem were not secured. However, 1 British battalion was able to establish perimeter on the north side of the Arnhem Bridge. But bad intelligence hurt the operation. Unknown to the Allies, the British dropped into the 9th SS and 10th SS Panzer divisions. The German divisions were resting, refitting, and therefore under strength, but their presence would create havoc in the next week. The airborne assault was in conjunction with an armor drive by the British 30th Corps, spearheaded by Guards Armored Division. They ran into very determined and unexpected resistance, advancing only 7 miles on the first day. Operation Market Garden continues as a fog prevents reinforcement airdrops at Arnhem until in the late afternoon, German forces launched strong attacks against the British positions at Arnhem. Attempts to reinforce the battalion in the town and the bridges proved fruitless. The 30th Corps was able to advance 20 miles, relieving the 101st Airborne, but was forced to stop to repair the bridge at Somme. Elements of the 82nd Airborne engaged the heavy street fighting in Nijmegen as they moved into the bridge there. By September 22nd, 30th Corps was unable to advance to within 6 miles of Arnhem, but no further. 2 days later, the operation is called off, and Operation Market Garden was in total shambles. Return to the Philippines. Admiral Chester Nimitz took the vital island of Saipan and the Marianas Island chain. Saipan was close enough to Japan that B-29 bombers could now begin to reach it without risking fuel shortages. The next stop was to retake the Philippine Islands. The battle to retake the Philippines begins on June 19, 1944, with the Battle of the Philippine Sea, fought entirely with carrier-based aircraft, resulting in the U.S. loss of only 50 airplanes, with 72 more crashing, while Japan lost 500 planes and 3 more carriers. On July 18, 1944, Premier Tojo resigned as head of the Japanese government. The Army landed on October 20, 1944. Japan, now realizing the importance of the raw materials there to its war effort, launched an attack. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf on October 23rd to 26th, the largest naval battle of the war, in which there were 3 separate engagements, was a decisive Japanese defeat. The Japanese lost 24 ships, including 4 carriers, 3 battleships, and 10 cruisers. The offensive capacity of the Japanese fleet was destroyed. The Japanese introduced the kamikaze, or divine wind, young Japanese pilots who purposely crashed their planes loaded with fuel and bombs into U.S. warships. But why the suicide? Japan had very few experienced pilots, and the majority of pilots were shot down and killed on the first day. So it was thought, if you're going to die, you might as well take out a carrier or a battleship. Unfortunately, this adds to the belief that the Japanese would rather die than surrender to Allied forces. The election of 1944. In the 1944 election, the Republicans nominated Thomas Dewey. Henry Wallace was replaced as FDR's running mate with Senator Harry Truman of Missouri. The leaders of the Democratic Party knew FDR was gravely ill and he would probably not make it through his 4th term, so they needed a very strong person as his vice president. The campaign was very simple. You do not change horses at midstream. FDR easily would win his party's nomination and the presidency with an electoral vote of 432 to 99. The popular vote was much closer, 53% of the popular vote to 46% of the popular vote for Dewey. The air war in Europe. The strategy. Bombing of Germany was a consistent event. Americans bombed during the day when the missions had greater accuracy but were more dangerous. The British bombed at night when it was safer. This was not thought of as the British failing to pull their own weight, but as a right earned since they had been involved from the start. The workhorse of the 8th Army Air Corps for the United States was the B-17 Flying Fortress. It could actually fly based on one engine. It was called the Flying Fortress due to the number of machine guns that could protect from every area on the plane, and they would always fly in box formation. This would become an important turning point in the bombing raids in Germany occurred when P-51 Mustangs, pictured in the left corner, could begin successfully escort American bombers deep into Germany and relative safely. Despite the bombing campaigns like the fire bombings in Dresden, which you see in the pictured right-hand corner, tens of thousands of German civilians were killed. It does not break the spirit of the German people. In 4 raids between 13 February and 15 February of 1945, 1,300 heavy bombers of the British Royal Air Force and the British in the United States Army Air Corps would drop more than 3,900 tons of high explosive bombs and incendiary devices on the city of Dresden. The resulting firestorm destroyed 15 square miles of the city center and caused thousands of civilian casualties. The bomb raids in Germany, the Allies conducted on factories, began to cripple the German economy. A higher call. 5 days before Christmas in 1943, a badly damaged American bomber struggled to fly over wartime Germany. At its controls was a 21-year-old pilot. Half his crew lay wounded or dead. Suddenly, a German Messerschmitt fighter pulled up on the bomber's tail. The German pilot was an ace, a man able to destroy the American bomber with a squeeze of a trigger. This is the true story of the 2 pilots whose lives collided in the skies that day. The American, Second Lieutenant Charlie Brown, and the German, Second Lieutenant Franz Stiegler. On December 20th, when after a successful bomb run on Bremen, Second Lieutenant
Charlie Brown and his B-17 Fortress named Ye Old Pub was severely damaged by German fighters. Luftwaffe pilot Franz Stiegler had the opportunity to shoot down the crippled bomber, but did not do so. Instead, escorted it over the past German-occupied territory so to protect it. Stiegler was able to see the injured, incapacitated crew. To the American pilot's surprise, the German did not open fire on the crippled bombers. Stiegler instead recalled the words of one of his commanding officers from Jägerschwadron 27, Gustav Rodel. During the fighting in Africa, he stated, "If I ever see you or hear of you shooting a man in a parachute, I will shoot you myself." Stiegler later commented, "To me, it was just like they were in a parachute. I saw them, and I could not shoot them down." This is called the Code of War. In 1986, the retired Lieutenant Colonel Brown was asked to speak at a combat pilot reunion event called the Gathering of Eagles at the Air Command and Staff College at Maxwell Air Force Base in Alabama. Someone asked him if he had any memorable missions during World War II. He thought for a minute and recalled the story of Stiegler's escort and salute. Afterwards, Brown decided he should try to find the unknown German pilot. After 4 years of searching vainly for U.S. Army Air Forces, U.S. Air Force, and West German Air Force records that might shed some light on who the other pilot was, Brown came up with very little. He then wrote a letter to a Combat Pilot Association newsletter. A few months later, he received a letter from Stiegler, who was now living in Canada. "I was the one," it said. When they spoke on the phone, Stiegler described his plane, the escort, and salute, confirming everything that Brown needed to hear to know he was a German fighter pilot involved in the incident. Between 1990 and 2008, Charlie Brown and Franz Stiegler became very close friends. The first year they met, it was just between them and their wives. The following year, Brown says, "Well, Franz, won't you come down and we'll do this again?" Stiegler showed up. To his surprise, it was not just Charlie Brown and his wife, but the living members of his crew, their children, and their grandchildren. And Charlie said, "Franz, because you did not pull that trigger, there are over 30 people that are alive today." And that is the code of honor on the battlefield. You do not shoot an unarmed man, because that is not war, that is murder. The Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, took place during frigid weather conditions, with some 30 German divisions attacking battle-fatigued American troops across 85 miles of the densely wooded Ardennes forest from December 16th to January 25th. It would be Germany's last mounted major offensive. 130 English-speaking Germans were infiltrated into the American lines in 30 captured American jeeps. They rerouted road signs, told cock and bull stories of a planned assassination of Ike in Paris. NCOs were able to stop everyone in asking questions that only an American soldier would really know, such as, "Who is Mickey's girlfriend? Where does little Abner live?" and Dogpatch. "Who are the bums?" which were the Brooklyn Dodgers. The Malmedy Massacre was a war crime committed by the German Waffen-SS unit led by Joachim Peiper near Malmedy, Belgium on December 17. 84 American prisoners of war were shot. 43 would end up surviving. The American 101st Airborne Division, led by Brigadier General G.C. McAuliffe, was surrounded in Bastogne. When asked to surrender on December 21st, McAuliffe replied, "Nuts!" This had to be explained to the German commander. Patton's Third Army would break through the lines and relieve the battling bastards of Bastogne, as they were called by the American press, on December 26. On December 30th, American forces regrouped to slow the German advance, and by the end of January, the German offensive was finally halted. The Americans would suffer 19,000 American soldiers killed in action, 47,500 wounded, and 23,000 plus missing. It was the bloodiest battle for the Americans in the European theater. About 100,000 Germans were killed, wounded, or captured.
The Allies emerged victorious 1945. The Philippines. General Douglas MacArthur fulfilled his vow of I shall return. The Battle of Manila would take place on February 4th through the 24th, 1945. Manila was finally liberated by Allied forces on February 24th. By March, the Philippines were returned to Allied control only by July 5th, 1945. The United States casualties were 12,000 dead. The Japanese suffered 400,000 casualties. Japanese commanders just refused to surrender and continued to fight to the last man. The Holocaust. By 1939, Nazi concentration camps held about 25,000 people who were mostly political prisoners. But with the beginning of the war in Europe on September 1st, 1939, SS death squads followed the German army, killing Jews, Poles, and Russians, as you see pictured in the bottom right corner. Others were herded into ghettos or shipped to concentration camps. Life in the camp consisted of hunger, humiliation, and hard labor. The final solution. The attempt systematic genocide, destruction of an entire people group of Jews and other people that the Nazis considered unworthy. But even before this was decided, there was some talk among the Nazis of just gathering all the Jews and sending them to Palestine. However, influences of individuals such as the Mufti Haj Amin al-Hassani, you see pictured there talking with Adolf Hitler of Jerusalem, had escaped Iraq after a failed revolt to drive the British out of Iraq failed. He would escape to Berlin and lobby for the extermination of all the Jews, specifically the Hungarian Jews. He would intervene on the Eichmann-British deal, in which the British would turn over German prisoners of war for Jewish children in the exchange. As Allies began to defeat the Germans from east and the west, they began to uncover the horrors of the Nazi death camps. Auschwitz was the worst camp. Dr. Mengele used children, especially twins, for scientific experiments. SS doctors separated the weak from the strong. Other atrocities included extracting the gold from their teeth, using skin to make lamps. Those destined to die were ordered to strip naked and led to the shower, where they were executed using cyanide gas, then burned or cremated in the ovens. Some of those were being used as scientific experiments, as you see in the picture in the upper portion of the slide. This poor man was placed in a pressure chamber to see how long it would take of pressure before a human being would die. Soviet troops would come upon the camps which millions of Jews had been killed. As Allied troops liberated conquered areas, they could scarcely believe the horrors. European Jews suffered the most deaths in the Nazi death camps. In the aftermath, 11 million people lost their lives in the Holocaust. 6 million were Jews. The United States would liberate Buchenwald and Dachau. After seeing what was going on there, martial law was established, and Germans living near the camps who said they didn't know what was going on were ordered by the point of bayonet to walk through the camps and sometimes bury the dead. American soldiers, being American soldiers in the European theater, were even wondering why were they even fighting the Germans in the first place. It was the Japanese that attacked them. But after seeing the horrors of what they witnessed in the death camps that they liberated, General Dwight David Eisenhower would say, "The men say they do not know why they are fighting this war. Now they know what they are fighting against." Back to the Pacific, the Battle of Iwo Jima. On February 19th, Marines landed on Iwo Jima, whose only use was an emergency landing strip for crippled planes. It would be an ideal operation base for B-29s. Several days later, U.S. Marines would plant an American flag on top of Mount Suribachi. The battle would finally come to an end on March 16th after 20,000 casualties and 7,000 American deaths compared to 21,000 deaths out of 22,000 Japanese soldiers stationed on the island. The Yalta Conference. Meeting of the U.S. Presidents Franklin Delano Roosevelt, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin was held on February of 1945 to plan the final stages of World War II and the post-war arrangements. As you could see the frailty of FDR, many believed that Stalin would take advantage of this. In Europe, the Allies had decided in 1944 to establish British, French, American, and Soviet occupation zones in Germany and Austria. The Soviets agreed to join a new international organization, the United Nations, whose foundations were set at the conference in San Francisco in the spring of 1945, and asserted control of all the land it had controlled. The Soviets also promised that after the defeat of Germany, within 90 days, the Soviet Union would declare war on Japan, and they also promised free elections for Poland. The end of the war in Europe, 1945. Unfortunately, Franklin Delano Roosevelt did not live to see the end of World War II. He died on April 12, 1945. After his death, Vice President Harry Truman would become the President of the United States. On April 30th, Hitler, at the age of 63, committed suicide in his Berlin bunker as the Soviets were already infiltrating into Berlin. On May 1st, the German provincial government announced his death. Mussolini was also captured and shot by anti-fascists, hanging his body upside down along his mistress in the photograph in the bottom left-hand corner. On May 7th, German unconditional surrender was accepted at the Allied headquarters at Rheims. On May 8th, VE Day, Victory in Europe, was proclaimed. The end of the war in Japan. Submarines and bombings of Japan also devastated the Japanese economy. The American Army Air Force B-29 had carried out destructive fire bombings in Japan. The American firebombing of Tokyo was likely the largest mass killing of all, estimated around 150,000 dead. The prolonged fight to take Okinawa was the largest amphibious operation in the Pacific. Okinawa is only located 360 miles from the Japanese mainland and had been planned for a strong staging point for an Allied operation invasion of Japan. Overall, about 35% of American troops, around 49,000, were counted among the casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. Even they had to face Japanese civilians to try to fight them. A third of the pilots and a fourth of the submarine personnel died in the costly battle. Operation Downfall was the plan to invade the Japanese mainland islands. As part of the Operation Downfall, American B-29 bombers and firebombing raids on Tokyo and other Japanese cities increased. And the extent of the devastation caused by these bombings were brutal, especially on the impact on Japanese civilians. The Manhattan Project. Many scientists who helped develop the atomic bomb for the United States had escaped from fascist Nazi aggression in Europe. Italian-American scientist Enrico Fermi led the project that developed the atomic bomb for the United States. The Manhattan Project was the code name for the project that developed the atomic bomb, and J. Robert Oppenheimer was chief scientist of the project. It was so secret that not even Vice President Harry Truman knew about it until he was given the authorization to sign for the testing of the first bomb, which was Trinity, on July 16, 1945, that exploded in the New Mexico desert, prompted Oppenheimer to say, "Now I am death, the destroyer of worlds." The Potsdam Conference. After FDR's death, the future of Germany was debated at Potsdam, and Japan was given an opening for surrender. The statement from Potsdam, issued by the United States during the meeting of U.S. President Harry Truman, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who would be later replaced by Attlee, who won the election in Great Britain, and Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin at Potsdam, Germany, near Berlin. The plan to defeat Japan and the future of the Eastern Europe and Germany In it, the United States declared its intent to democratize the Japanese political system and reintroduce Japan into the international community and gave Japan an opening for surrender. At the conference, the Allies demanded the unconditional surrender of Japan or face destruction by a newly developed weapon. There has been a great debate on whether Truman should have used the bomb or not. When realizing a land assault on the mainland Japan would likely result in 1 million Allied casualties, Truman's use of the new weapon against Japan made good sense at the time. Would also serve as a warning to the Soviet Union of our potential power, who was already causing problems already in Eastern Europe, and it looked like they were not going to promise free elections in Poland. The cost of the building the bomb was $3 billion without the knowledge of the Congress and the American people. To discover the U.S. had a powerful weapon that could end the war early and was not used would be devastating politically to Truman. Bombing of Japan was similar to the bombing strategy that was used from Germany, but this is just one more powerful weapon. But the main reason behind Harry Truman's decision to drop the atomic bomb was American officials believed that the Japanese would fight up to the point of annihilation. August 1945, the bomb was ready, and Truman ordered it to be used on Japan if it did not surrender before August 3rd. On August 6th, the bomb Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima from the Enola Gay, piloted by Colonel Paul Tibbets, obliterating 78,000 lives in an instant and leading to the death that reached 140,000. Others died from injuries and radiation poisoning. Still, Japan would not surrender. 2 days later, the Soviets finally declared war on Japan on August 8th. The next day, August 9th, the second atomic bomb, Fat Man, was dropped on the port city of Nagasaki, killing 71,000 people. The next day, on August 10th, Japan surrendered, asking to let Emperor Hirohito to keep his throne. On 14th of August, Japan accepted the Allied terms of surrender, and its troops in Korea surrendered to the Soviets above the 38th parallel. Finally, Japan agreed to surrender on August 14th. This was declared VJ Day, Victory over Japan, and formally surrendered on the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay on August 2nd, 1945. The Second World War was officially over. The most horrific war in human history had come to an end. Over 70 million fought in the war, of which 25 million died. Civilian deaths numbered greater than 24 million. It's estimated between 50 to 70 million people actually died in the war. Why did the Allies win? A common misconception of World War II is that the victory of the Allies was certain from the time America entered the war. This was not true. The Allies won with economic capacity, technology, and military skill. The ability to outthink and outmaneuver the enemy staved off defeat in 1942 and 1943, and the ability to outproduce the enemy assured victory in 44 and 45. In addition, the Allies had the appeal of democracy and freedom that made the Axis nations aggressors and gained Allied support among conquered peoples. When the war ended, the American people realized that the isolation ways that they had returned to after World War I could not be considered again. The difference about America after World War II when compared to 1940, differences between ethnic and religious groups were not as great in magnitude. We're next going to focus on 3 American heroes. The first, Staff Sergeant Edward A. Carter Jr., had entered the United States Army on September 26, 1941. As a result of his previous combat experience fighting Japanese in China and part of the American Lincoln Brigade during the Spanish Civil War, he was promoted to Staff Sergeant. He could speak 5 languages. On March 23, 1945, Carter, then a 28-year-old infantry staff sergeant, was riding on the tank when it was hit. Dismounted, Carter led 3 soldiers across the American field. In the process, 2 of the men were killed and the other seriously wounded. Carter continued on alone and was wounded 5 times before being forced to take cover. 8 German soldiers tried to capture him, but he killed 6 and captured the remaining 2. Carter was fluent in German, one of the 5 languages he could speak, and the prisoners provided valuable information on enemy troops' dispositions for his unit. He refused to be evacuated until he could give a full report to his superiors. For this, he was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross on October 4, 1945, and promoted to Sergeant First Class. His award would be upgraded to the Medal of Honor on January 12, 1997, when it was learned 50 years later that no African American was ever awarded the Medal of Honor during World War II. PFC Sato Munomori was born in Los Angeles, California to Japanese immigrant parents. He was a Nisi, a second-generation Japanese American. Nunani had volunteered for the U.S. Army in November 1941, 1 month before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, and he was inducted in February 1942. He was soon after removed from combat training and assigned to menial labor. While he was transferred to the series of Midwestern and Southern Army posts, his parents and siblings were incarcerated at Manzanar, Wyoming. When Japanese American soldiers were allowed to re-enter active service in March of 1943, Munomori volunteered for the part of the all-Nisi 442nd Regimental Combat Team and joined the 100th Infantry Battalion known as the Purple Heart Battalion in the European theater, fighting in Italy and France. In Cervassa, Italy, his unit was pinned down and commanded the squad devolved on him. He made frontal one-man attacks through direct fire and knocked out 2 machine guns with grenades, withdrawing under murderous fire and showers of grenades from other enemy emplacements. He had nearly reached a shell crater occupied 2 of his fellow Japanese Americans when an unexploded grenade bounced off his helmet and rolled toward his helpless comrades. He rose into the withering fire, dived for the grenade, and smothered the blast with his body. By a swift, surprising, heroic action, Munomori saved the 2 men of the cost of his own life and did much to clear the path for his company's victorious advancement. He is the only Japanese American to be awarded the Medal of Honor during the war. Lieutenant Audie Leon Murphy was son of a poor Texas sharecropper. His father abandoned them and his mother died when he was a teenager. Murphy left school in the 5th grade to pick cotton and find other work to help support his family. His skill with a hunting rifle helped feed his family by shooting rabbits. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, Murphy's older sister helped him to falsify documentation about his birthday in order to meet the minimum age requirements for enlisting in the military. Turned down for being underweight, less than 120 pounds, by the Navy and the Marine Corps, who said, "Look, the Marines make men out of boys, but you're too much of a challenge for us. Talk to the Army. They'll take anybody." He enlisted in the United States Army. He first saw action in the 1943 Allied invasion of Sicily. Then in 1944, he participated in the Battle of Anzio and the liberation of Rome and the invasion of southern France. Along the way, Murphy was promoted through the enlisted ranks until given a battlefield commission as second lieutenant on October 14, 1944. On January 24, 1945, as company commander, the Germans attacked his company and scored a direct hit on an M10 tank destroyer, setting it alight. Murphy ordered his men to retreat to position in the woods, remaining alone at his post, shooting his M1 carbine and then directing artillery fire via his field radio. While the Germans aimed fire directly at his position, Murphy mounted the abandoned burning tank destroyer and began firing its 50 caliber machine guns at advancing Germans for an hour, killing or wounded some 50 Germans. He sustained a leg wound during his stand and stopped only after he ran out of ammunition. Murphy rejoined his men, disregarding his own injuries, and led them back to repel the Germans. He insisted on remaining with his men while his wounds were treated. For his actions for that day, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. Murphy became the most decorated U.S. combat soldier in World War II, awarded all 33 medals and decorations that his nation could give him. Not bad, for the little man that no one wanted. The Nuremberg War Crime Trials. An international tribunal of 23 nations would convene and try war criminals for the first time leaders of a nation held responsible at Nuremberg. Nuremberg was chosen because that was the place of the Nazi rallies. The charges: Count 1, conspiracy to wage aggressive war. This count helped address the crimes committed before the war began, showing a plan to commit crimes during the war. Count 2, waging aggressive war or crimes against peace, including the planning, preparation, initiation, waging of wars of aggression, which were also wars in violation of international treaties. Count 3 were war crimes. Those were the more traditional violation of the law, including treatment of prisoners of war, slave labor, and use of outlaw weapons. And Count 4, crimes against humanity. This count involved actions in concentration camps and death rampages, specifically the Holocaust. 22 defendants were initially tried. 12 were sentenced to death. Göring, von Ribbentrop, Keitel, Kaltenbrunner, Rosenberg, Frank, Frick, Streicher, Schackel, Jodl, and Seyss-Inquart, Bormann, who was absent. And they were hung on October 16, except for Göring, who cheated the hangman by committing suicide with a cyanide capsule 2 hours before. 2 were given life sentences, Raeder and Hess at Spandau until the 1980s on the assistance of the Russian. 2 were given 20 years, Wouter von Schirach and Speer. 1 was given 15 years, Narath, and 1 was given 10 years, Donitz. 3 were acquitted, banker Schacht and Fritz, sub-boss for Goebbels, and Silver Fox von Papen. Japan got off relatively light compared to the leaders and others in Nazi Germany. Only 28 Japanese military and political leaders were charged with some 55 separate counts encompassing the waging of aggressive war, murder, and conventional war crimes committed against prisoners of war, civilian internees, and other inhabitants of occupied territories. The trial would take place from April 29, 1946 to November 12, 1948. Absent from the prosecution were Emperor Hirohito and other members of the imperial family, which might have been regarded as potential suspects. But it's the Truman administration and General MacArthur particularly who both believed that the occupation reforms would be implemented smoothly if they used Hirohito to legitimize their charges. Of the 28 charged, only 7 would be found guilty and executed, to include General Hideki Tojo. It was interesting is Tojo tried to commit ritual suicide, but was stopped and saved by medical personnel, just so they could hang him, which happened with him and 6 others on December 23, 1948. Just like the ending of World War I with the Versailles Treaty, we also see territorial changes that happened after World War II. Most notably, you see Germany lost a great portion of its territory, and later on would be split into 2 separate countries of West Germany and East Germany. The Soviet Union would then take in Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as part of the Soviet Socialist Republics. Before the war, these were legitimate countries. And the areas they took from Poland, known as My Russia, they were able to keep. Poland was able to take territory away from Germany, as you see that were in the brown area. And so officially ends our study of the Second World War.